It is a tremendous honor to welcome Professor Nancy Unger, or Unger,
Unger.
Unger, yes. She is the Professor of History at Santa Clara University. We're here to discuss her biography of Senator Robert La Follette Sr., titled Fighting Bob La Follette, the Righteous Reformer. How are you today, Nancy? Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I should like to begin by asking you, how come the senator is nicknamed Fighting Bob?
Well, I mean, he really was a fighter. He loved a fight. And in some ways, I think that's what makes him really effective. And in other ways, I think it works almost to his detriment because he's not compromising Bob or, let's cooperate with other people, Bob. He's fights for what he believes. And that is a great asset. But it also sometimes I think it's a little too much. I really struggle when I look at his life and trying to figure out how much compromise in politics is inevitable. Is it a weakness to be a compromiser? And he felt almost always that it was. And I don't think that's true. So he's a fighter, and in some ways that's a great strength, and otherwise I think it limits him.
I see. I think there's a tradition of American politicians who are beloved by the public for being fighters or by being perceived as fighters. Your previous American president was among them, for better or worse. But I think, but for for figures like the founding fathers or Lincoln, they are more well known as being more sober-minded compromisers. So I suppose there are two ways in which you can enter history as a politician, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I think there are fighters who don't, politicians who are big fighters who don't get what they want, but the opposition knows that they will fight so hard against what the opposition wants that it does kind of blunt them. So sometimes I think fighters don't maybe get the credit that they deserve, not so much for what they achieve, but often for what they prevent.
Hmm.
And I think politicians who prevent certain things are in some ways just as effective as those who achieve certain things.
Mhm. So who would you name as examples of the preventers?
I think others in the Senate knew.
Oh, sorry. I think we were interrupted for a bit. So
Okay.
I was just asking you about the preventers, and we were left off from there.
So I was the example I can think of from more recent times is Ted Kennedy.
Mhm.
Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. He was a diehard liberal. And there were certain things that you knew that you were just not going to get through the Senate because Ted Kennedy was going to gather his formidable resources and stop it. So I think that there are, again, I think that it's easier to identify those who lead by, creating things and causing things. But I think if you know there's going to be a real block against certain things, then you kind of people just don't pursue it. So I think La Follette was an interesting combination of somebody who did create a lot of legislation and pushed forward with it, but he also was, I think, really good at shutting other things down. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
Mhm. So what would you name to be examples of legislative initiatives that La Follette helped shut down?
Um, well, I have to think about that one. That I would say it was more just sort of I think more than in specific initiatives that I can think of, that it's more just the trend that he championed. That he was just saying, look, we can't have this kind of, you can buy your way into the U.S. Senate, you can do whatever you want, you don't have to represent the people. I think that he was really very effective in just shutting down that kind of stuff. and saying, no, you can't continue to deny women the vote. We can't have political machines continuing to have this kind of power. That old style of politics that was admired for a number of years in the Gilded Age. I think he was a great leader in saying, no, that is not representative government. And yes, this country, the United States, is changing and developing very quickly. It's gone from being this little rural nation to an urban industrial giant. But that doesn't mean that the politics can be completely corrupt and so forth. And I think that he was very effective in helping in being one of the leaders in really changing. We had kind of runaway politics in the United States, I think, in the late 1800s. And I think he was one of the people who helped to try to get us kind of back on course of a representative democracy.
Mhm. Yes, and I do notice that there are always two currents of American politics since the founding. One, I would say, the Hamiltonian wing, which specifies the need for institutions to balance out these differing political interests. And there's the Jeffersonian wing, which emphasizes the representation of these different interests against what they see as the elites, the aristocrats. So I suppose in that sense, Senator La Follette stands firmly in the Jeffersonian tradition.
Yes, I think that's very fair to say. I think that he really was very concerned, as many of the progressives were, that the United States was really the government was really heading in the wrong direction. And even though, and I think it's one of the things that he was really. Sometimes you have the right people in at the right time, and I think just as this country really was changing very dramatically, as I said, from being rural to urban to being industrial and so forth. It was really, I think, key that that somebody really worked to shake it up. I mean, it's pretty appalling when you look at Gilded Age politics and just how brazen politicians were, how open they were about the things that they were doing. We see perhaps the most famous is one of the political bosses, Boss Tweed, saying, "Oh, I saw my opportunities and I took them." He says, "I practice honest graft." Which basically means, yes, you have bribed me, but I'm going to deliver what you bribed me for. So that makes me honest. So it's just like, yeah, it's play for pay and that's fine. And people are getting what they want. And what's the problem? And I think that that was getting, just really out of hand. Not that American politics are by any means pure today, but it was so brazen. And one of the things I do in my classes and in my talks and so forth are show some of the political cartoons that really try to communicate how bad it was getting. There's a famous one of a bunch of vultures sitting on the top of the U.S. Senate building, and the sign says "Seats for sale." That essentially you could buy a seat in the U.S. Senate. Senators were not elected were not nominated by the American population. They came in through legislatures and so forth. It's like, no, this is really getting out of control, and we've got to stop this quickly, or this country is going to go into a very different direction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there's also a different political cartoon that I can remember, which consists of I guess the House of Congress, and there are these very big, very fat, cartoony Monopoly man types, and they represent the trusts.
Yes, they're you're right. They're big money bags. They're great big money bags, and each one of the bags, one of them will say beef, and one of them is sugar, and one of them is, I don't know, iron or whatever else. And the caption of that cartoon is "The real bosses of the Senate." These are the ones who are really in control. And so, and it's a fabulous cartoon. And if you look up at the top, you can see that there's a public entrance to Congress, and it has been closed. It's nailed shut. And so this is exactly the kind of thing that the progressives are saying, yeah, this has really gotten bad, and we need to do something about it. That's a wonderful, I think, really instructive cartoon.
Mhm. So for those who are maybe quite unfamiliar with this period of American history, myself included, what were trusts and why should they be broken?
Well, trusts were a way, say, you and I and five of our friends all we all have sugar companies. We're all in the sugar business. And so we can either compete with each other and lower our prices to try to compete with each other, or we can say, look, I don't know, there's 10 of us here. Let's form a trust. All right. And so that way we will all agree to keep our prices high. This way we can all profit. No one will undercut us. And we can basically keep others we will so dominate the sugar market that we will keep others from entering into the market. So this is a way of creating, so it's just sort of an informal organization, but they do this to set prices and to really control a market.
Mhm. Right. So
So I'm sorry, just to add a little bit. So we have people like John D. Rockefeller, who basically he owns oil in the United States. He doesn't need a trust. He just does it himself.
Mhm.
But he's an extreme example. In most of the industries, there might be, 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever, but those are the big companies, and they really they control the entire industry. So few can be quite as successful as monopolizing as Rockefeller, but many through these trusts are able to control a whole industry.
I see. Which I think brings me to a misconception that many people who are, say, conservatives, who call themselves conservatives today, misunderstand about progressivism, is that it is anti-capitalist, whereas I think antitrust is probably the most pro-capitalist move you can be, because it encourages free competition.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That they were not anti-business, they were anti-monopoly. Just as you're pointing out, they're saying, well, this really isn't business. If you have a trust that controls an entire entity, and you have, many of the major entities that this society, runs on, controlled by trust, then you're exactly right. You can't have free competition. You can't have new people, new companies trying to work their way into the market. It's just impossible. So these oligarchies just sort of, really take over. So yeah, the progressives were very much pro-capitalism, and particularly pro-competition, and making businesses, really sort of have to earn, customer loyalty. One of the big concerns was that these big businesses were immune to the discipline of the consumer. If you say, well, I'm not going to buy Armor beef products anymore. Swift Armor was a huge beef company, meat company. So, well, I'm not going to buy, I'm not going to buy that anymore. Well, they don't care. It's not like when you have a little ma and pa store and you all buy, in the little local community. If the people get together and boycott a store, it will go bankrupt. These big companies were so enormous that they were sort of untouchable. And so that was another thing that progressives said, is that they are immune to the discipline of the consumer. They can do whatever they want. They're untouchable. And so no, we need this competition. Some of the big trusts said, well, competition is wasteful. This is more efficient. And we're delivering a more uniform product. And, it's not that they were completely wrong in some of their arguments, but the key thing is exactly what you said, that it really eliminated, the sort of, the economic competition that's sort of at the heart of capitalism.
Mhm. One of the significant things I find in the progressive era is that you can find both progressives in the Republican as well as the Democratic Party. Bob La Follette was obviously a Republican and a progressive, which is not something that you can find in today's Republican and Democratic Party. Those who identify themselves as progressives are mostly in the Democratic Party fold. So tell me about this, I guess, bipartisan progressivism.
Well, you're right that it's very confusing. When I'm teaching my progressive era seminar, my students are like, "Wait, these are the Republicans? These are the Republicans?" And it's like, yes, these are the Republicans, like Bob La Follette, who grew up remembering Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican. And so they say, yes, we are the party of Lincoln. We are the Republicans. You don't want to go with those Democrats, because the Democrats were the really racist party, particularly in the American South. So it was an interesting period that the Republicans were really dominating the progressive movement, for its first many years. But where I see it really sort of jumping the track is when Woodrow Wilson, who's a Democrat, is elected president, and he doesn't say, "Oh, whoa, 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 we're going to pull back all this, these Republican progressive reforms." He says, "Yes, a lot of these are really good ideas," and he continues to implement them. So that's where I think we see. I mean, there had been Democrats and Republicans on all sides of these issues and so forth, but this is where I think we really see it go from being heavily Republican, progressivism being heavily Republican, to a more bipartisan approach.
I see. Now, I think nowadays the bipartisan consensus is what you call neoliberal, and which but there's a strain of old style Republican Party that's being dominated under, say, Trump. Now, of course, as of this recording, the current senator from Wisconsin is a man named Ron Johnson, and he is possibly the most anti-La Follette figure that you can find. He's stridently conservative and stridently partisan. La Follette, I don't think he's he's as partisan as Johnson is, or
No.
not. So to what extent was he loyal to his party, La Follette?
La Follette was much more bipartisan than I think most senators can even be allowed to be in this day and age, because everything is so polarized. La Follette basically wanted to get his progressive legislation through, and if that meant crossing the aisle and working with Democrats who he could persuade on a particular thing to join with him, he would do that. He was much more on sort of a case by case, issue by issue thing than he was a staunch Republican. But I think politics were just very, very different then. I would add, though, that Wisconsin's other senator is Tammy Baldwin,
Yeah.
who is, extremely liberal and of the La Follette mold. So Wisconsin has been a very I think a really interesting state. There's an old poem from when we were kids. We all know this, that there was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. And I said, that's Wisconsin. That it's either, got Bob La Follette leading the liberal charge, or it's got Joe McCarthy bringing in this whole anti-communist hysteria. And in recent years, it continues to kind of go back and forth. So it's a really interesting state that you can't say, oh, Wisconsin, it's always going to be red or it's always going to be blue. It really has some big swings.
Yes, which brings me to what extent are both parties historically contingent? So in some ways, if you are a longtime Democratic voter, you might find yourself alienated by, say, what the Democratic Party was or has become, or the same way if you are a Republican.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think I'm not sure this is answering your question, but I think today it has become so extreme. And so you have I don't know, say a Mitt Romney, who is clearly he's a diehard Republican, but so for the people on the left, he looks very conservative. But in the current, sort of among the Trumpers, he's unacceptable because he's so liberal and he's not, lining up behind Trump. So, I mean, I'm 67 years old. And I don't recall seeing these kinds of divides in the course of my lifetime. I mean, people will say to me, oh, the country's never been so divided. And I'll say, they had this thing called the Civil War in the 1800s. It's been a lot more divided than it is today. But it is there doesn't seem to be the room to kind of maneuver around that Bob La Follette had. He could cross the aisle. He could, and I think, as you're saying, today, even if you really want to do that, I think it's virtually impossible based on, the current climate in party politics.
Mhm. I suppose one of the conceptions that people who are more conservative make about progressivism is that they were championing these very divisive reforms that may not be agreeable to the American public. Well, obviously, the extending the franchise to women is one, and um, introducing popular vote to the Senate is another. So those are the two that I can think of at the moment. So were the progressive as divisive as say conservatives make them out to be?
I think they were very divisive, and I think the two examples that you gave are excellent examples. But I would say even stronger than that was a very strong business community.
Okay, so we just pick up from there.
So I think for the business community, the even more threatening than I don't know if it was more threatening than women getting the vote, but the idea that this was breaking up what they said was their God-given right to make money and profit and so forth. That I think was really a huge divide. So yeah, I think that the progressives were were certainly painted by their opponents as anti-progress, anti-freedom, basically a bunch of socialists who were really trying to impede progress and stop it. And they said, you're going to ruin the country by you're going to take away the profit motive. You're going to coddle the poor and make them, even weaker and more dependent than they are now. I mean, I think there was a real sense of that they were really, these two sides were really sort of arguing about the future of America.
Mhm. So I've mentioned before the Hamiltonian tradition, and I think for people like Hamilton and the Federalists, popular sovereignty is a notion that they were really skeptical about. But nevertheless, I think a conservative attack on progressivism that I think can be quite legitimate, and it was manifested in, say, people like Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, is that in order to advance progress, so to speak, the progressives are handing over too much power to the state in order to make these reforms into reality. So how would you answer to this line of criticism?
Well, I think the argument that they're handing over too much power was met by no, we have too much concentrated power. This we used to actually believe, whether it was true or not, the brag was that in the United States, unlike our European predecessors, for example, it didn't matter what class you were born into or what your title was, that we had upward mobility in this country, this notion of the American dream. So if you worked hard and you were a good person, that you would be successful. And obviously that was really aided if you were white, if you were a man, if you were, any number of things. But nonetheless, that was the idea. And so the progressives said, no, you are destroying that. There is no way that, some poor person, no matter how hard they work, no matter what a good person they are and so forth, is going to be able to compete against one of these trusts or whatever else. So, we're not saying, oh yes, give all power to the people, take it away from here, but but it's not just like, oh, we want to, coddle these poor people. It's like we want to give people a chance. And the system that we're heading into is only creating the very, very wealthy, some middle class people, and all the rest are going to be poor and they're going to stay poor.
Mhm. I think that's the notion of the American dream is one, if not one of the many reasons why Karl Marx and Marxism did not make its way comfortably into American society, because Marx envisions a brutal war between the classes, whereas Americans, they don't see themselves as members of different classes.
I don't think it's so much that they don't see themselves as members of different classes. I think they see that as temporary.
Mm.
I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who they are not, it's undeniable that they're poor. I think that, but rather than saying, yes, I'm poor, I'm going to be poor forever, I think to this day, there remains this notion of upward mobility. And upward mobility can be defined a number of different ways. For a number of immigrant groups, and even some older stock Americans, it was generational. It wasn't so important that maybe you got to be wealthy or college educated or whatever it is, but your children did. And for some, it's like, look, there is upward mobility. All right. Where the country because we're such a nation of immigrants. So for many different immigrant groups, the argument was, yeah, things are really hard here and we're struggling and there's racism and all this really tough stuff. But back home, we would be dead because of political persecution or whatever, or be much poorer than we are now. And yes, this generation will probably remain pretty poor, but because of public education, because of some other things, our children will do better. So it isn't like upward mobility is a complete fantasy. Some people did do better, and enough, I think, did better either in their own generation or the next did to keep that faith alive. And so I think that that's a lot of what kept Marxism from taking hold in the United States. I also think it's a practical problem too. During this period in the progressive era, the late 1800s, early 1900s, where I think it might have had its greatest possibility, this was such a nation of immigrants. People didn't speak the same languages. They didn't have the same political ideas. I mean, it's very different in a country like that than it is where everybody speaks the same, has the same cultural heritage and so forth. So that diversity, I think, that in some ways is the nation's great strength, also was kept people fairly divided. I mean, if you look at some of the protests and so forth, even people are on the same page. They'll say, there's going to be a big, union meeting tonight, and it's in 6 different languages. Because there's again that diversity, I think, made it harder for people to unify and have the same kind of ideas. So I think it's the two things. It's that plus the enough evidence of upward mobility that kind of kept people going.
Mhm. Yes, and I think with all this, rising economic as well as social inequality that your country is experiencing, there's a gradual loss of faith in this promise of the American dream. So I wonder if yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think it's
Mhm.
true for some people, but one of the things that I find fascinating is if you ask an American if they are of the upper class, the middle class, or the working class, virtually everyone of the working class says that they are middle class.
Yeah.
Even if they're living at the poverty line. I think that there is this notion of upward mobility, even though it doesn't really exist. And I think because there's very fuzzy lines. Well, what does it mean to be middle class? In other words, I continue to be surprised that socialism, even unions, have such a hard time getting a hold in this country. And I think that belief in upward mobility, the American dream, as sort of, sappy and unrealistic as it is, I still think it's very strong in this country.
I see. That's wonderful. So how would Senator Bob make the case for the American dream?
Well, I think he would say, look, if you oligarchs, if you big trusts would just get out of the way and let the American people speak, let them vote in senators, let them have more of a say. He said, we can keep democracy going, and if we break up these huge trusts, we can restore competition, healthy business competition. And this is what's going to allow people to be rewarded for good ideas and to compete and to build up society. But you and I know we continue to see a few people who have a couple of really good ideas just take over. You've got Bill Gates and Microsoft. You've got Starbucks. You've got these other Amazon. These huge companies. So this is always the tension. It's like, well, if we're going to reward good ideas, then shouldn't these, individuals and huge companies get to reap the benefits of this? But then we're right back to where we started from. Then there's no room for other competition. So that's a tension that I think keeps going. And that Bob La Follette was very concerned about, that you have to it's fine to be successful, but if you're successful to the point where you are totally dominating an industry, then that's too much, and those have to be broken up. And it's not like you have to go bankrupt or be torn down, but we have to make room for competition.
Mhm. Now, the Jeffersonian, I guess, declaration or maxim that all men are created equal is, I think, very powerful in the American mind, in that I don't think America would have such a vigorous debate on inequality versus inequality if the founding document, the Constitution, do not have that enshrined in it. So I think deep down, again, regardless of the level of wealth, Americans see themselves as equal to those who are richer and poorer than them. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
And so I guess my question would be, to what extent does La Follette champion the fulfillment of this maxim?
He does, I think, more so than virtually any of his contemporaries, because he says this applies to African Americans, to Asian Americans, to Jewish Americans, to all kinds of people who are facing open, blatant racism at this time. He says this is about women, not just that women should have the vote, but that they are equal beings. I mean, he really believes this stuff. And one of the things that I find really interesting about the United States is that, you're right, those founding words are so powerful. The Declaration of Independence is so stirring. And, there's all this wonderful rhetoric. But there's the whole, at the time of the American Revolution, as for me, give me liberty or give me death. This is, uttered by a man who owned slaves. I mean, there's just this really this huge contradiction going on there. But Bob La Follette is one who believes those words literally, that all people are created equal, and that puts him, I think, way ahead of his time. That and it really seems to be sincere in all ways, and he's very public about it. And I think he doesn't just spout the rhetoric. He actually takes it literally and tries to enforce it.
Now, I think that in many ways, equality might be a profoundly radical notion, because when you look at societies that are not American, especially in India, where you have a caste system, maybe not formal anymore, but it is religiously enforced. So those who are, I guess, born and raised in that Hindu mindset may not have the inkling of themselves being equal to their fellows. But the fight for equality can also be profoundly radical, because on the surface there's this notion, the this group of persons is merely fighting for equal rights as you are, but that can mean profound changes to a regime or a nation that bases off on the notion of unequal personhoods. So the Civil War, as you've mentioned, was fought between one conception of equality and, well, another, I guess, lesser, so to speak, conception of equality. And I suppose the same with the suffrage movement. So thank God the Republican did not break away because women wanted the vote. So how would Senator Bob make the case for women suffrage?
Well, this is a really good question, because one of the things that is very problematic for me in the suffrage fight is that it proceeds along two tracks. One is all people are created equal. Women are as as bright as anything else as men. It's just that we should have the vote on the basis of our democratic ideals and total equality and so forth. That's not the winning argument. The winning argument is women should have the vote because they're the nurturers, and they're more sort of, idealistic, and they care for the children and so forth. And so they will bring their, so men, if you just let men vote, you'll get the society that we have before women can vote. It's all about competition. It's about strength. It's all about money. The argument is, let mothers vote, let them bring their housekeeping skills to the political arena. So it's a really very sexist argument. And so when women get the vote, it's really not on the basis of equality. It's more on, well, women, should have the vote. Basically, Wilson wanted them to have the vote because they would give the stamp of approval to World War I. He says World War I is a war to make the world safe for democracy. And if women will support the war, that makes it look altruistic and moral and so forth. So I would say the prevailing argument was much more on, it's sort of a gendered argument. Bob La Follette does not support that argument. He says women should have the vote because they are equal, because they have equal capacities. And what's impressive to me is that he practices this at home. He has a feminist marriage. He is enormously supportive of his wife's career, and he gives her credit all the time for, like, if somebody will come to him in the Senate and say, okay, we really need to work on this, this, and this. He says, well, let me talk to Belle. That was his wife's name. Let me talk to Belle about it first. She's his most important political advisor and so forth. So this is a long answer to your question, but for Bob La Follette, he really did believe in the democratic ideals of true equality, and that applied to women, to people of color, to recent immigrants, to Native Americans, to everybody. And he's unusual in that regard.
I see. So since you've mentioned the First World War, one of Senator Bob's positions, most important positions, is his opposition to America's entry, which obviously placed him in opposition to the Democratic progressive Woodrow Wilson. So what was his case?
Well, he said, look, this war has nothing to do with us. All right, the United States has no stake in this war. And he says, look, what happens when a country goes to war? That becomes the priority. You can't go around during wartime and saying, we have to discipline these businesses. We have to regulate them, because the businesses will say, do you want to win this war or not? He said, if we get into this war, it will set back the progressive movement by a generation. This war really is just an excuse for the big business people to get back into charge, to get rid of to stop our progress towards regulation, and to regain control. So he says this war, yes, Americans died on the Lusitania. Americans were warned not to travel on the Lusitania. It was very clear that they were in danger. They chose to do that. The Germans put out ads in the newspaper. So it's like, no, we don't have, this is not our fight And so he just felt that this was, he said, look, we have enough to do at home. We can't run around telling other people how to run their countries. This is the war to make the world safe for democracy. Let's start at home. Let's make our nation truly democratic before we start trying to impose this on other people. So he was vehemently opposed to the war, and that made him unusual among Republicans. I mean, most of the, I mean, he was, there was just a little handful of them that were that were opposed.
Mhm. I think a view that was predominant at that time, and a view that certainly President Wilson believed in, is that there's the possibility that international commerce or free trade can help prevent war from happening. But I suppose with La Follette, he believes that war is a catalyst for business to flourish. So
Yeah.
did he believe that
Yeah.
to be the case?
It's a catalyst for business to flourish. And he said, okay, look, at the end of the war, we have, Wilson has his 12 points, it's 14 points. I'm sorry, it's 14 points. There's going to, create this ideal world. And as I think it was Clemenceau said, 14 points. He said God himself had only 10. I mean, who is this, this Wilson who thinks he's got this map to, so we're going to have, no more entangling alliances and freedom of the seas and all this stuff. And of course, none of those things were realized. So it's just like, no, this war is not going to bring free trade and peace and so forth. It's just sort of the blueprint for, for World War II. I mean, I clearly, Wilson envisioned a world, with his 14 points, if those could have been enacted, it would have been a very different post-war world, but that's just not how it worked out. And I think there was tremendous resentment in Europe. It's like, who is Wilson to come in and tell us what to do, and that we shouldn't be seeking retribution and so forth when, we've lost millions of people. So, I mean, these were just people talking past each other, and it just didn't work. And La Follette predicted that. So we shouldn't get involved in this war. And, these 14 points are not, that's not going to happen. And we're going to be dragged into, whatever else is coming along, when we should just really be focusing on cleaning up our own house before we start looking into cleaning up other people's.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, Wilson's 14 points basically define how Americans conduct their foreign policy today, whether you're a Republican or a Democratic administration. So, in the long run, speaking of today, so to speak, when Americans have perhaps more foreign entanglements than you guys can handle, has Robert La Follette Sr. been vindicated in this front?
I don't know that he gets much attention concerning the world today. But when he came out against U.S. entry into World War I, he was vilified. He got spit upon in the streets. He was hung in effigy. There are cartoons of him getting the Iron Cross from the Kaiser. I mean, it was astonishing to me that he was able to get, there was an effort to eject him from the Senate. But he stayed in, and over time, the apologies came in. Mm-hmm. You were right. Senator La Follette was right. Everything that he predicted was right. One of the cartoonists, I think it was like 14 years after La Follette's death, finally wrote an apology. But he, even during his lifetime, he got, and he died in 24. I think really, he said, I have no regrets about my war vote. And he did receive a lot of recognition that what he said was correct.
And we see a lot of this vilification of fellow Americans in the subsequent wars or major conflicts since, right? You have, I guess, people like Charles Lindbergh, for better or worse, being vilified for his stance against World War II. His stance before Pearl Harbor. And
Hmm.
even today, with this whole Russia-Ukraine war going on, there were people uh, who um, who favor restraint, so to speak, are being deemed, Putin's sock puppets or something like
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and then there are people who are saying, look, the United States is a wealthy, strong nation with a wealthy, strong military. We have an obligation to go in and help people. And others are saying, first of all, I mean, are we really the police force of the world? Is this really our job? When again, we don't really have our own house in order yet. I think this is a perpetual division within the United States, and I think that up until Vietnam, the argument was generally speaking, we have to be involved. If we don't get involved now, we're going to have to get involved later. There was the whole domino theory that if, these nations fell, ultimately we'd have to fight it in our own backyard and so forth. Vietnam was such an unpopular war. And I think that kind of put a pause on this. Oh, we'll go and get involved into everything. Right now, I think the nation is much more divided. There are people who are like, yes, we have an obligation, we must do this. Others are saying, no, we've gone down this path before. It's not our business. And there's a lot of division about foreign entanglements. Yeah.
that. Which is a debate that I would really welcome. I think what I don't welcome is the caricaturization of the other side as either being friendly with the enemy or being warmongers and such. That's very
Yes.
healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's one, you really put your finger on one of the huge problems in American politics today, is that it's not just like, these two sides have different views. It's that each side accuses the other of being evil and wrong and un-American. So if those are the accusations going back and forth, there's no middle ground. There's no, where can we find common ground? What can we discuss? What happens is just escalating of the vilification. And as you're suggesting, it then it makes it impossible to really have any kind of real conversation.
So,
Yeah.
which brings me to the question of whether Senator Bob La Follette Sr. was admired during his time, I suppose even by his political opponents.
Oh, I mean, certainly there were people who vilified him throughout his whole life. But I think the real answer to your question is that, he keeps getting reelected, but the people of Wisconsin love him, and they reelect him even after, he was vilified for his World War I vote and ongoing opposition to the war. And I think that there were a few of his contemporaries who were just frustrated with him. It's like, buddy, that's fine that you're righteous and so forth, but we would like to get something done. We would like to work together. There's a great moment where La Follette is talking to Theodore Roosevelt, and Roosevelt is president, and they're talking about a coal bill. And La Follette says, no, we have to veto this bill. You have to veto it. It's not, and Roosevelt says, well, but I want to get something through. He says, half a loaf of bread is better than no bread. And Bob La Follette says, no, it's better to go hungry, because then you'll fight for the whole loaf. Don't compromise. So there are politicians who say, no, this is not how politics work, and they get frustrated with him. But there are others, and particularly among his constituents and even among some of his colleagues, it's like, all right, maybe he's a jerk sometimes, but you've got to admire this guy. You always know exactly where he stands. And, he does compromise, occasionally here and there, but he is admired, I think. Even those who disagreed with him on his World War I vote said, you took a lot of guts to not just vote against entry into the war, but to then not say, not he never apologized for it. He said, oh, he never said he was wrong. He said, no, I was right about that. So there were people who really admired him. I mean, I'm one of these people who's very torn about it. On the one hand, as we started this conversation, I said, I get frustrated because he is so uncompromising. He's so righteous. But on the other hand, there is something really admirable about somebody who won't back down and who really does what he believes is right, and sticks with that. So it's really kind of a mixed bag.
Yes, I'm of the same view as you, actually. So
Mm.
I think there's always a current of cynicism in electoral politics, especially when it comes to America. I think it can be evoked by people like Gore Vidal when he says that, well, in order to be a elected politician, you have to be bought and sold so many times that you become like a creature of different corporate interests and such. And Robin Williams, has a funnier take on it, where he says that, well, every politician has to uh, emblazon themselves with sponsors as if they are like NASCAR race cars of different companies and corporations and banks that sponsor them. So, do you believe that La Follette may be an example of those who can have both, the cake of personal integrity and eat it too, i.e., get popularly elected, so to speak?
Yeah, and I think it was easier in his day than it is today. You didn't have to raise gazillions of dollars to run a campaign. You didn't need all those corporate sponsors blazoned on your outfit. But even Bob La Follette, when he's running for governor, he says, "Well, I'm going to stop these political machines." And they say, "You have your own political machine." And basically it's like, well, even if it's used for good, he still had, so I think even in that day, it was pretty much impossible to just say, "I'm a good guy, let me, go forward." On the other hand, Bob La Follette never had any money. He was always in debt. I mean, this isn't a guy who, I mean, most politicians today, at least in the Senate, and in Congress, are, they're millionaires. They started off with a lot of money and so forth, and he didn't, and he never he never made enough money. He drove his wife crazy. So I think that he really did have a lot of integrity, but I can't say, oh yes, he never compromised his principles. Or I mean, one of the things that drives him crazy when he's governor is he gets millions of letters from people in Wisconsin. "I want to be the game warden," because he gave out those kinds of tasks, and thinking about who to give these to and so forth. I mean, that's a kind of political payback and so forth. He wasn't immune from that. He was doing those kinds of things just like all the other politicians were, and that's no excuse. But I do think that he had his moments. He did make some political compromises, although not many. So I think, but I think some of this has to do with his personal integrity, and some of it has to do with the fact that it was easier, I believe, to act out of personal integrity in his day than it is today.
Mhm. I certainly see that in order to be a successful elected politician, whether if you're a Republican or Democrat, you must kind of like pay some lip service to the moneyed interests and the banks and big businesses and such. So, do you suppose that
I don't know that it's lip service so much is that you want their contributions to
yeah,
run your campaign.
yes,
And it's interesting. I mean, a lot of big companies give to both parties.
yes.
Um, and so, there's a whole money component that it's always been in American politics, but I think it's much more intense today.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that brings me to the question of what should the proper relationship with, I guess, White House and Wall Street be?
Well, I don't know about the White House and Wall Street. One of the things I'd really like to see, and they'd talked about it for a long time, campaign finance reform. There was a bipartisan bill there for a while. To me, what I would like to say is you get X amount of money. All right. Every candidate can have a budget of up to whatever it is. And then that's it. So it's not who can buy the most television commercials. It's like, no, you all have, everybody gets, you get your, I don't know, $10 million campaign or a billion or whatever the heck it is. I would really like to see that rather than, because I don't believe that whoever has the most money wins. But often that is what happens. Too often, I think that is what happens. So for me, one of the big things I'd like to see is campaign finance reform. Just to make a level playing field and say, okay, you all get the same amount of money, assuming you can raise it. Now, how are you going to use it? I think that maybe I'm naive, but I like to think that would solve some of our problems.
Mhm. I think another issue is how the money is spent too, because in order to pull more donors, more big donors, the ads have to be as divisive as possible.
Yeah, yeah. I will say though, sometimes I actually get a little bit of hope. Many years ago, here in my home state of California, there was we have a lot of initiatives, and so the people have to vote. All right, if people can initiate legislation, or there are referendums where they ask the people to vote, and you get these booklets, and you think, you'll say, what is the argument for measure A? And you read it and you say, yes, measure A, I want measure A. And then you turn the page and it says, here's the argument against measure A. And you think, oh, I'm against measure A. And then you read the rebuttal and you go back and forth and back and forth. And the way I decide these things is I look to see who's funding it, because they have to say who's funding it. So it may say, this is a big green initiative. This is for the environment. We want this, this, and this is for the environment. And the others say, don't be fooled, it's not for the environment. And I have to say, oh, who's paying for this? Is it Standard Oil? Or is it, the Sierra Club? And that pretty much tells me what, what's really going on here. So now I forget the thread of this of the question.
Attack ads and political division.
I remember it was. So there were a bunch of these on the ballot, and the oil companies and so forth were, outspent the environmentalists like 10-1.
Yeah.
But the environmentalist won. So it isn't always that the most money wins, and that the attack ads always win. But again, I think that they do too often stack the deck. Yeah. Yeah.
So I would like to conclude by asking you, so what drives Robert LaFolletz's belief in the, I guess, the integrity and sovereignty of the American people as opposed to the non-democratic interests?
It's a really good question, but okay, I have this little quote from him, and I hope you'll bear with me with this. He says, America is not made, it is in the making. There is an unending struggle to make and keep government representative. So I love this about him. He doesn't say, okay, we're going to solve the problems and that's it. It's like there's always going to be a struggle. There's always going to be corrupt people who are only driven by money and so forth. And he says, it can't just be the politicians. He really believes, he says, mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who are aggressive from what is wrong. So he says, if you just leave this to politicians, it's just going to get out of control. People have to be involved and they have to pay attention. He says, there is work for everyone. The field is large. It is a glorious service, this service for the country. Every American should count it a patriotic duty to build at least a part of his life into the life of his country, to do his share in the making of America according to the plan of the fathers. So he says, yes, call me naive, call me idealistic, call me whatever you want, but I really do believe that this is the people's country. And as long as people are paying attention and voting and getting involved, that democracy will continue to be maintained. If they don't do that, we will not have representative government. So he believes you just can't elect good people and then sit back. That people really have to be involved and stay involved. And he's adamant about this. He devotes his whole life to believing this. It's a little bit like John Kennedy, who said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. You know, La Follette believed that. And it wasn't just like, oh, it'd be good for you to help. It's good for the country. You know, we can't just let it devolve to a little handful of leaders. It has to be the people's country.
Mhm. Well, of course, Kennedy, I believe, in his book Profiles of Courage, listed La Follette as one of the courageous men, right?
Yeah. And he was on a committee that voted for La Follette to be, I think he's one of the top 5 senators in American history or something else. He really admired La Follette. So yeah, and if you go into like the U.S. Congress building, every state in the United States gets 2 statues, and one of the 2 from Wisconsin is La Follette. So when you walk into the Capitol building, you see him there. So his presence is still there. I mean, he did enough to be really, a lasting figure. Although fewer and fewer people have heard of him, but I think that's pretty much true for U.S. senators. I think if you're going to have really big name recognition over time, you have to be president.
Mhm.
But I do think that he's one of the better remembered senators and so forth. So he did mix, the other thing I like about him is he is very practical. It's like, oh, I have all these high political ideals. How exactly are we going to do that? So he would literally stay up late burning the midnight oil, trying to come up with comprehensive, practical plans how to more equally distribute the wealth and power of the country. Because that's what he wanted to do. We have to more equally distribute the wealth and power of the country. But that's easy to say. What does it really mean? What kind of legislation is it going to take? And he was very good at promoting that kind of detailed legislation. What kind of income tax structure do we need to redistribute wealth in America? What kind of regulations do we need on railroads to keep the railroads working and profitable, but also not allow them to so dominate the country? He just had really good practical, let's sit down and see what that would really look like kind of ideas. I really admire that about him.
Mhm. Well, I'm doing my term paper in one of my classes on La Follette, so I hope
Oh,
to
great.
change that. Hope to get his name being recognized more.
Good. I'd be thrilled because I think, he's not perfect, but nobody is. But I think he's really admirable in so many ways.
Right.
So,
Well, on that wonderful note, thank you very much, Professor Nancy Unger, for joining this program.
well, thanks very much. It was a pleasure to be here. I'm always happy to talk about Bob La Follette.